Hello, welcome back, Hilbert students. Last time we met, we were talking about the battles of Lexington and Concord and how the first shots of the American Revolution had been fired. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the early part of the war. The early part of the war is going to take place in New England, mostly Boston. A lot of things happened in Boston. Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, first major battle of the American Revolution, Bunker Hill. We'll talk about that today. But after that, not only will we talk about what the colonists were doing militarily, we'll talk about what they were trying to do diplomatically as well. We'll get into the Declaration of Independence. So let's go ahead and get started. So after Lexington and Concord, the British Army was chased back into Boston. And that's where they're going to be trapped. I'm going to show you a picture of Boston in a second. There's only one way by land into Boston, and after the British soldiers retreated back to Boston, the militiamen, the Minutemen, they surrounded Boston, and the only way out for the British would have been by boat. And so let's take a look at the first major battle of the American Revolution, Bunker Hill. Now there are two hills in Boston. There was Breed's Hill and there was Bunker Hill. This battle is actually fought on Breed's Hill. They call it the Battle of Bunker Hill. I don't know, but Battle of Bunker Hill, and whoever had these hills, it was a strategic benefit for them. And the colonists sent men up there to set up some defenses. But the British knew that they could not let the Americans hold these hills because the Americans could put cannons on top and just fire out at the British ships that were coming in. And so Britain couldn't have that. They needed these hills. So we're going to have our first major battle. And what's happening is the British are going to attack. They're going to attack numerous times. And 3 times to be exact, and they're going to be successful on the 3rd attempt because the colonists are going to run out of gunpowder. A famous quote from the Battle of Bunker Hill is, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." That was the American commander telling his soldiers, don't fire until they're really close. They couldn't waste any gunpowder. So the British attacked once, knocked back, attacked a second time, knocked back. 3rd time was the charm for them. That's when the Americans had to retreat because they were out of ammunition. Considered a tie, but it did a lot for American morale. 1,000 British soldiers are going to be killed, around 500. Actually, I want to say casualties, and a casualty will be killed or wounded. And the British had 1,000, the Americans had 500. Here's a picture of Bunker Hill. So you got Bunker Hill, you got Breed's Hill, both located in Boston. Here's that one area that you can get in and out of Boston by land. And the Americans had the British surrounded. And so any boats that were coming in, if the Americans had these hills, they could just fire cannons at them and sink the boats. So that's why this battle was fought. The British are still going to be stuck in Boston. They'll escape. So the British can only escape by boat. And another thing that the American Army did was a gentleman by the name of Henry Knox came up with the idea. They had captured a British fort, Fort Ticonderoga. It was captured by Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys. Benedict Arnold was also there. And the fort wasn't really all that important, but what it did, it had a bunch of large cannons. And so Henry Knox came up with the idea, let's get the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, let's move them into Boston, and they lined the perimeter of Boston with these cannons just looking down at the British in Boston. When that happened, the British commander said, we gotta get out of here. So 9,000 British soldiers and 1,100 loyalists are going to board over 100 boats, and they're going to escape Boston and they are going to go to Halifax, Nova Scotia, what is today Canada. Those soldiers are going to be coming back, and we'll talk about that in the future. 1,100 loyalists left with them. A loyalist was a colonist who remained loyal to England. And then you had patriots. A patriot was a colonist who wanted to break away from England. All right. So the loyalists went because they didn't trust the people living there. Before they left, they destroyed Boston. But now the British have escaped, and the early part of the American Revolution is fought in the New England colonies. As the war goes on, it will move into the middle colonies, and then at the end, it will be fought in the southern colonies. We'll get to that. So just another picture of why the Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill were so important. So now, between Lexington and Concord and the British retreat from Boston, it was about a year, all right? And during that time, the colonists, they weren't running around saying, oh, we want to be independent, we want to do that. They still thought of themselves as British subjects, all right? So then we're going to talk about some historical documents that start coming out at this time. There's going to be 3 of them. We're going to talk about the Olive Branch Petition, Common Sense, and then the Declaration of Independence itself. The first one I want to talk about is the Olive Branch Petition. The Second Continental Congress, before saying, hey, let's go to war with Britain, they said, hey, let's send a petition to the king, and it's called the Olive Branch Petition because in ancient times, if someone was presented with an olive branch, that was like a show of peace. So what did it state? In the Olive Branch Petition, the colonists said, hey, king, we love you. Parliament, they're a pain in our neck. And so we got to do something about Parliament, and could you get rid of those intolerable acts? The king refused to read it. He was so mad at the colonists, he declared the colonies in open rebellion, and that he wanted his ministers to bring the traitors to justice. The king was mad. He didn't like what was happening in the colonies. He wasn't going to listen to this Olive Branch Petition. All right. So now let's take a look at what's happening in the colonies with common sense. There's a gentleman by the name of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was from England, and Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, and what he did in simple words, he wrote down why the colonists should declare their independence from England. And he wrote it in such simple terms that a lot of people around the colonies could read it. Their reading ability wasn't the greatest, but it spread quickly in the colonies. 120,000 copies were printed. But a little background on Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine grew up in England, and the town that he grew up in was where the king or the crown or the government would hold public hangings. Anyone who had broken the law could be hanged. People for things such as killing the king's deer could be hanged to death. And so Thomas Paine grew up this town. He saw people being hung by the British government, by the monarchy, and he became an opponent of the monarchy right away. All right, he didn't believe in what they were doing. He was also against something called divine right, and the kings and queens of Europe at the time. Well, why them? Why are they king and queen? And they would claim something called divine right. It was God who chose them. All right. They were picked to be king or queen by divine right. God picked them to lead. And Thomas Paine didn't buy that one either. But 2 arguments that Thomas Paine had was there's something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. So here we are in North America, big old continent, and England across the ocean, an island, is governing us. We're way bigger than England. It didn't make sense. Also, England is 3,000 miles away. It doesn't make sense. We have a problem. We send someone to England, takes 4 or 5 months. They respond, takes 4 or 5 months. It's not a way of doing things. So Thomas Paine came up with some common sense arguments why the colonists should break away from England. And then the third document I want to talk about today is the Declaration of Independence. This was a radical writing in its time. You had a people declaring independence from the greatest country in the world. Everyone saw England as the greatest country in the world. Their citizens had the most rights in the world. People thought that the colonists were nuts to declare their independence. But a declaration committee is going to be formed. It's going to be made up of 5 gentlemen. Livingston, Sherman, Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson. And it's their job to come up with a declaration, a list of reasons why they should break away from England. This had never been done before. Here they want to break away, and they're going to write down on paper a list of reasons why. Jefferson's going to be chosen to write it because he's the best writer of the 5. And the declaration is going to be found in 3 parts. Part 1 just lists the basic rights that people have, all right? And it starts off, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. Now, there's been a lot of controversy. All men are created equal is in there, and yet when this was written, there were slaves. Are all men created equal? I'll get to that in a second. It went on to say, if a government disregards those rights, then it loses the right to govern. And if a government does not allow those rights to exist, then the people have the right to abolish that government by force if necessary. So that's what they're saying. They're saying the English government's not treating the colonies right. It is the right of the colonists to form their own government. Right? Radical thought. Part 2, very simply, what Thomas Jefferson did is he wrote down a list of things that Britain had done to the colonists that he felt were not very, for lack of a better term, not very nice. So, he has dissolved representative houses. We talked about the New York Assembly was not allowed to participate or meet anymore because they refused to follow the Quartering Act. So that's what that refers to. Oh, I just like this next one. Sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. Tax collectors, officers in the military. Kept among us in times of peace, standing armies. A lot of British soldiers in the colonies after, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, all that. They sent more and more British soldiers there. For quartering large bodies of troops among us. Quartering Act. And then lastly, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. All those laws, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, that's what he's referring to. So part 2, very simply, a list of things that Britain had done to the colonies. And then the third part, he declared that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. So he ended by saying, hey, it's because of these reasons we should be free. And it ended with the phrase, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The gentlemen who signed the Declaration of Independence, the moment they put their signatures on that paper, were wanted men by the British government. That act of signing the Declaration of Independence was considered to be treason. They were acting against the interests of the British government. And there was an article written a long time ago. The gentleman's name was Rush Limbaugh. He's a controversial guy, but he wrote an article titled Our Lives, Our Fortunes, and Our Sacred Honor about what happened to the signers of the Declaration of Independence. It's a very interesting article. And then there was one thing left to do. The colonies, they approved it, but then there was one change that was requested. And that was the southern colonies. There was a paragraph in the Declaration about slavery. Thomas Jefferson wanted to ban slavery. He blamed the king for the slavery. He wanted to get rid of it. The Southern colonies refused to approve the declaration if that paragraph was not removed. They claimed that the New England colonies benefited from slavery just as much as the Southern colonies. Now, the Southern colonies had all the slaves doing the work down on the plantations, but the ships that brought the slaves over, they were owned by New England traders. So Jefferson wanted the paragraph in there. The South said, if you don't get rid of it, there will be no declaration, because all 13 colonies had to approve the declaration for it to pass. The paragraph was removed. The Southern colonies approved the declaration. All right, and then finally, the declaration was finally approved on July 4th. And that is why every year we pick the 4th of July to celebrate our independence from England. All right, so there's going to be a quiz going along with this. If you need help or you want to go back and take a look, this PowerPoint and this video will both be on my Google Classroom. And as always, if you have any questions, just let me know. Talk to you later.